All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for our LinkedIn Live event on organizational health. And today we're talking about how sexual harassment in the workplace impacts organizational health. And have working with organizations for and leaders for as long as I have, I've realized that sexual harassment is not an HR problem. Okay, it's a leadership issue that needs to be corrected, needs to be dealt with, but a lot of times we just don't do it. So I've got a guest today. Lisa Sheldon is a co-founder of Faro Consulting, and this is what she does. So welcome, Lisa,
Thank you. I'm
and
happy to be
take
here.
a, take a few minutes to introduce yourself and tell us about Faro and how you're involved in this.
Yeah, so we at Faro Point Consulting are a employee relations firm. We really focus on handling the toughest employee issues. So we are not an HR firm. We don't do benefits and insurance. We really focus on when something goes wrong in the organization, how can you bring in a neutral party to come in and assess what's going on and make recommendations? Unfortunately, a lot of those issues that arise are misconduct related, whether that's harassment in general or sexual harassment specifically. That's an area that we specialize in. My partner Allie and I come from the US government. We were federal employees for more than 20 years. Our background started in intelligence analysis, actually counterterrorism analysis, which is unique in our current field. Most folks within employee relations don't have that background, but it really gives us a foundation of analyzing problems from all different directions, collecting all the information, making really unbiased determinations, and then recommendations to address the issues. I was part of an agency of 2000, and I was brought in to head up the sexual assault and sexual harassment, standing up of the program and then running the program for several years. So I have unique insights into what you can see in large organizations, problems with addressing sexual harassment, mistakes that are made, and also among small organizations that we at Faro Point have worked with as well. So I am very pleased to be here. I think this is the timing of this is really critical in that when it comes to talking about harassment, talking about sexual harassment, we've definitely seen a drop off in those discussions in the last few months, but it doesn't mean there's a drop off of issues within organizations. So I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. So whenever I talk about a topic, I always think it's important to define the topic, right?
Yeah.
And so let's do that. Maybe if you can help us out defining what sexual harassment is, because a lot of times I think we make assumptions
Yeah.
that it's, there's a physical aspect to
Mhm.
it, or and maybe that's limited to it. And so let's define it. What is sexual harassment?
So we can do it really simply in a broad term that would just be unwanted behavior that's sexual in nature. So that's the easiest way that we can define it. And then lots of organizations will sort of tack on explanations of what that behavior might look like, what it might sound like. I'll just hit on the first part, unwanted behavior. So when we think about two coworkers who are working together, so I think back to my husband and I who met in the military. We're both in the Army at the time. And when I give classes on sexual harassment, I will say, how many of you have met your partner or your spouse in your work environment? And invariably, it's a quarter of the people say, yeah,
Yeah.
I met my spouse at work or at a work event. And that means at one point, one person had to ask the other person out. And the other person said yes, which means it wasn't unwanted. So when we think about those relationships that are within a work environment, if it is two people dating, casually dating or more seriously dating, but it's wanted, then it does not fall into the sexual harassment category. The one caveat I would make to that is when we see a power dynamic. So if
Mhm.
it is somebody who is a CEO of a company or someone's supervisor, maybe a subordinate does want their supervisor to ask them out, but it's not appropriate for that work environment. But that really comes down to the policy of the organization or the company about internal dating. When we talk about unwanted behavior of sexual nature, when we look at that word behavior, it can be discussions, it can be statements directly to someone, it could be statements to another person about someone. And I can give you one example of this. So, our government organization, and several others because I worked for several. So I won't identify which one this was, but every summer there were interns that came in from
Mm.
college during the
Yeah.
summer. And there would be comments from, I'll say typically guys who would be very excited when the summer college female interns came in, and they would make comments to each other about what the new interns look like. So those comments were certainly sexual in nature. It was how attractive they were, how short their skirts were, whatever those comments they were making. It wasn't to the person, but it was about them. And those were sexually harassing comments. Very likely they were not wanted. They weren't wanted. I didn't want to hear those comments. So it was unwanted by me, even if it wasn't directed at me. So that's sort of the statements that we can see that would fall in line with sexual harassing statements. And that runs the gamut between talking about someone's attractiveness level, talking about potential sexual behaviors, talking about really lots of different things that could really be on that line. And we can talk more about like where the gray areas as well.
So, it's interesting. Both of us have a military background. Both of us met our spouse in the military. Both you and your spouse were in the military.
Yeah.
And so I know I saw this more in the military, and then, spending another 20 something years in federal service, I didn't see it as much, but I think it was my fault, because not that I was going to look for it, but it wasn't directed at me. But you mentioned about the comments. So whose responsibility is it to address these things, the comments, or, like if an intern came in and didn't hear the comment, it's kind of like if a tree fell in the woods, to make a sound. So if an intern didn't see it, exactly.
And
talk about that.
I think you're not alone, Larry. I think a lot of people would say, well, if it's not bothering anyone and we are in on the conversation, what does it really harm? And I think this gets to the crux of this conversation about organizational health. How do we see comments about what people look like, whether they're promiscuous, who they're dating, all of those types of comments? We see that as an overall culture and climate of the organization. And when you say who's responsible for the culture and climate, I firmly believe it starts at the top. It starts at the very, very top, not just by how that person in charge acts, how they speak about other people, but, and this maybe is the most boring part when it comes to this discussion, is policies, putting in the policies in place. So if you have a leader who talks a lot about we should respect each other, we should ensure that we're in a safe environment when we're talking together, but then there's no policy in place to uphold, when something happens, there's not a set of standards or a set of disciplinary actions, or even just who should react and who should be responsible. So I would say it starts at the top, and that policy should outline, if somebody is making sexually harassing comments, or even comments that just make me feel uncomfortable as an employee, who do I go to? That policy should be super clear about who I go to. And in most organizations, they don't have a specific person overseeing a sexual harassment program. They may have a security person if it's more than 75 people, but oftentimes it is HR. And then once again, HR has to know how to respond to those allegations. All of that comes down to policy, but it also comes down to the people in charge. And I can think about an organization that I worked with that had the policy in place, had the training in place, but the leadership, the top tier leadership, were the worst examples of egregious behavior. And not just the sexually harassing behavior, but also just harassment in general. And it's yelling at people. It is talking behind people's backs. It's that negative type of reinforcement that can really pervade and degrade the culture of the organization. And when we talk about health of an organization, sexually harassing behaviors specifically, what we see with the people who experience that sexual harassment is decreased ability to focus on their tasks, which is understandable. We use the term mental health issues, but I would just say sleep issues. We talked to a lot of folks who literally sat in the parking lot and didn't want to go in because they didn't want to hear again about what they're wearing and how it makes somebody else, how it makes their day that they're wearing a skirt. All of those types of things can degrade that particular worker's drive for the mission, drive for performance, but also unit cohesion. Because if you think about if I'm experiencing sexual harassment and John and Joe and Jane around me are hearing it, but not sticking up for me and not saying anything, then I lose trust in those around me. And if I'm reporting it to a supervisor and nothing's happening, I'm losing trust in the entire organization. But I think from an organizational standpoint, we should also consider what that does for the reputation of the company.
Right.
I can think about several scandals that have been on the news lately. Think about like the Coldplay concert where the CEO and the HR director were caught canoodling during a concert. You think about the scandals that have come out of Apple, that have kind of come out of these big companies where the seniors in charge are making really terrible decisions, whether it's an abuse of power toward a sexual relationship or sexual harassment that just gets buried. That reputation is harmed irrevocably. I mean, they can try,
Absolutely.
but here we are a year later still talking about these companies.
Yeah. Well, and kind of tying that into organizational health, one of the things we do, we come into organization, we look at 4 systems within an organization that define their health. We look at their operations or their efficiency. Do they deliver what they say they deliver on a timely manner? And are they making money?
Yeah.
And then strategy, right? Did the leadership develop a strategy that aligns with their vision, mission, and values? We look at their culture. Okay, does it support all of those? And we look at their leadership, primarily their leadership development. How are they developing leaders that are going to touch all of these systems? And we use a green, yellow, red. Where do you score in these? That determines how we help you. And you hit it on the head with, it's a leadership responsibility, because that's what sets the standard that everyone else is going to mirror. So let's say you got a policy, because here's one of the things I see in a lot of these is, I have a policy against sexual harassment. We have training. We send everybody to it, check the box. But what about enforcement and holding people accountable? Do you see a lot where they may have a policy and they're training everybody, but it still happens, like as you mentioned, that those leaders are the worst offenders? Well, we can't get rid of Bob because Bob is a high performer.
Yeah.
All right. But at what cost?
At what cost? That is an excellent question. And we're talking today about sexual harassment, but I think this can really cross over into the big bullies, the leader, the supervisor who is great at driving the team, but has had constant turnover of team members because of yelling, because of demeaning comments, that sort of environment. So number one, it does start with a commitment of the leadership to say, this is not something we want in our company. Here are the values that we uphold, and here's what we're going to do when you don't uphold those values. And having some sort of disciplinary action or disciplinary administrative process. So what's the first step when someone, whether it's, let's say it's I'm gonna think about a supervisor and a subordinate. And let's say the subordinate comes and says, my other coworker made comments to me about what I look like, and it makes me super uncomfortable. So what we see is there's a policy in place, but that supervisor says, well, I've got 2 employees. It's a he said, she said, or, some sort of situation. I don't really know what happened. And maybe they didn't mean it that way. Or they say, oh, I'll talk to her and I'll tell her not to say those things. But they never take action because it's uncomfortable. Yeah. And it's hard to do. And it feels like confrontation, and they don't want to get in the middle of it, and they're hoping it'll just go away. So I would say, the challenge that we find most often is not people are doing too much, that people are firing people who shouldn't be fired. And that's a question I get a lot about, like, what about false accusations? It's pretty rare. What we see is inaction. Because even if that supervisor says, well, I don't know what to do in this situation, let me talk to my supervisor. And then that supervisor says, oh, I know John, he would never say that. Like somebody's blowing it out of proportion. Just don't worry about it. Or they'll say, I don't think that's really sexual harassment. Talking about like how nice she looks today or how beautiful she is, she should be complimented. That's not sexual harassment, even if she doesn't want to hear those things or he doesn't want to hear those things. Right. The inaction is where we see the most risk from companies. So when we see things progress where an employee has reported something, there's a policy in place.
Mhm.
They've been trained on it. The company does not follow the policy that's in place. Nothing is done. That's when you see a lawsuit down the line filed. That's when you see that company's risk profile really skyrocket. So I think it starts with training, not just our supervisors, but training our employees. Not just the typical PowerPoint training where everyone sits and you go through the slides or you click through the requirement, but real
Yeah,
life.
which we all go to the end and take the test,
Go to
right?
the end, take the test.
Because we've done it so many times.
Is sexual harassment bad? Yes, it's bad. Of course, it's bad. But I think what is really lacking, and this is what research has shown, is that sort of training, the death by PowerPoint,
Mhm.
click through all the slides, is the worst sort of training when it comes to sexual harassment and harassing behaviors to counter that in the workplace. What is most effective is small group training and role playing and scenarios. Because what we find is that when people are in the situation, they react not only differently than what everyone around them would expect, but they react differently than what they themselves would
Mhm.
expect. And there's this really excellent study done in academia a few years ago, where they did this survey of a group of women and said, what would happen if you were in an interview one on one and the interviewer started making comments, sexually harassing comments? And the women who were taken, there was 50 women, they said, oh, I would throw the paper in his face and march out. I'd yell, I'd be angry. They all reported that they would be angry and that they would leave immediately. And then they tested that scenario on
Oh,
actual test
wow.
subjects. They pulled in people and said, we have a job offer at this university and we want you to come interview for it. I don't know how they passed ethics to do this, but they did. And they tested 50 more women. And you know what happened? Not a single person left. Not a single person threw down the paper and walked out the door when the interviewer started making these sexually suggestive comments. And most of them reported the feeling that they felt wasn't anger, it was fear. And
Yeah.
they locked up and
Yeah.
every single one answered every single question, including really inappropriate questions like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you think women should wear bras at work? I mean, these questions were like, why would anyone ask you that? But they answered them because when you're put in that position, your response is not like what you expect.
Yeah.
And Larry, you mentioned like we were both in the military, and the military is a really interesting organization to think about scenario and role playing. Because of course,
Mhm.
when we went to basic training, when we went to advanced training, everything's done in an environment to teach you to react, but to
Right.
not think when you react, because you're practicing so much that you know what to do. But most sexual harassment training, we don't practice that way.
Right.
If
Yeah.
I overhear someone saying a comment to John about how great his butt looks today, what should I do in that situation when I'm like, we're at work? That's not appropriate.
Right.
So there's actually a scenario-based training that we can do, and we do this as Faro Point. We can come in and give this type of
Mhm.
training as well about what do you do when you're a bystander and you see bad behavior, because that's really in a company or an organization. That's what's going to shift the culture to say, hey, that's not okay. So there are 4 different things that we recommend, and this is very standard throughout the industry. I'm not coming up with these on my own. I'd love to claim them, but they're not my.
Look at, well, you should.
I
Just
know.
trademark them. Call them something else.
Yeah. So what are the options that I have as a person? And when we do this role playing and training, we talk a lot about your own personality, because not all of us have the same inclination to take action. Not all of
Right.
us are an extrovert. But the four sort of options, and this is great to practice through within your own workforce. And whether it's a bullying statement, a harassing statement, or just like, oh, dude, don't tell that joke at work. That's not okay. So the first option is just a direct option. I go up to John and I say, John, that's not okay in our office. Don't do that. And some people, depending on my relationship with John, depending on my personality, might feel totally fine doing that. I'm actually one of those people that I feel okay just saying, hey, not okay.
Right.
Not everybody feels that way. Another thing that I could do is distract. So let's say John is telling this joke to Jim, and Jim's like, his face is like, oh my God, I can't, I don't want to hear this joke. What am I doing? I can just go up and say, hey, Jim, come here. I need you for a minute, and just pull him out of that situation for
Mhm.
that moment so that it's not continuing, and then address it later on.
Yeah.
The third thing is to delegate. So maybe I don't feel comfortable interrupting whatever's happening over there, but I feel like I need to let somebody know. Delegate. The third D, just go tell a supervisor, tell somebody else. And then the fourth thing, and I think this doesn't come up a whole lot, is addressing it in a delayed manner. So delay is our fourth D, and it means a month ago I heard something and it wasn't right, and it's just been gnawing at me. But now I
Hmm.
think it might be too late to do anything about it. And what we say that when it comes to this space, in most organizations, there is no statute of limitations. If I
Right.
found out that someone was sexually harassed or sexually assaulted a year ago, I can still go forward and report it. And I think, there's this perception that maybe there's an expiration on something egregious happening and that now I'm in the wrong because I didn't report it. And I would just encourage companies to ensure that their employees know that even if it happened 6 months ago, a year ago, they can always come forward and bring it up. Because what we
No, absolutely.
find is that once somebody thinks that it's okay to act that way
Mhm.
in a work environment, that behavior can escalate and it can expand to other people.
Yeah. And you talked about the avoidance of doing anything. And I think sometimes that feels safe in the moment, especially even if you're the recipient of it,
Yeah.
because you don't want it to continue. So I'm going to avoid it now. I'm out of once I get away from the situation, it's like it's over. But it's not,
Yeah.
because if it's going to continue, and the cost is long term.
Mhm.
So avoidance is an option, but not a good option, right?
It's
And
not a great option. And oftentimes
yeah,
we find people who leave their jobs
yes.
because of how awful it was.
And they never tell anybody. They just leave. Oh, I found something else, and we don't understand, because nobody does exit interviews anymore to
I
find out,
know.
why is Lisa leaving? She
Yeah.
was doing great, and
Yeah.
but you made a comment earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. You said, "What if I said, hey, Bob, your butt looks good." When we were preparing for this, you saw I was sending out some marketing posts like, "Hey, come check this out. It's going to be a great topic. Things we need to talk about." I think it was yesterday or the day before, and um, and I mentioned that I don't know why that
I know, we
switched this
just
around.
switched. That's
That's
okay.
weird. And I started writing it out, and I mentioned, that what would it be like to have an organization where women are valued, da 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 da. And then I started thinking, I was like, wait a minute, are women the only one that gets sexually harassed? So I changed it when
Yeah.
I just put people.
Yeah.
Um, and so let's talk about that a minute.
Yeah.
I'm sure the percentages are off the chart for women versus men,
Yeah.
but what other category? Who else gets sexually harassed in the
So,
office?
yeah, so it's interesting when we look at the statistics, and I just want to like flag this is very underreported. So the statistics that we have come from the Center for Disease Control. They did surveys of the workforce several years ago, and actually we continue seeing some surveys of the federal government
Hmm.
through the Merit Systems Protection Board. So we get some information about federal government workforces, and then the CDC looks at the broader workforce. And what it has found is that around 1 in 6 women, and some surveys say 1 in 5 women experience sexual assault, and 1 in 4 women experience sexual harassment within the workplace. And
Hmm.
some of those surveys have said up to 1 in 2, 1 out of every 2 women. When it comes to men, it's typically described as 1 out of every 6 men experience sexual harassment in the workplace. But I think, and oftentimes when we talk about sexual harassment or sexual assault, people assume that we're talking about rape. They assume we're talking
Yeah.
about something really on the egregious side, and that certainly happens. But we also see that escalatory behavior where it starts as comments every day about how somebody looks. And I'm thinking about an example in particular where I remember in this organization there was a supervisor, a male supervisor, who back in the day he would have been described as handsy. He was
Mm.
one of those guys who's a toucher, and some people loved it. Some people were like, "Yeah, hey, bro," hugging. It was great for them. But it became more than just um, collaborative, sort of hugging, collaborative
It was a
hand.
lingered hug.
It was a lingered hug, and we had a gentleman who came forward and said he would come up behind me and massage my shoulders. And I would
Okay, that's
shrug
just creepy.
I would shrug out of it, and I'd try and, and it started as just one hand on the arm, and then it started as one hand on the neck, and then both hands on the neck. Now, when we investigated this, other people would say, "Well, yeah, that's just how he is." And if someone doesn't like it, they
I
should
hate
just
that.
say, yeah, if someone doesn't like it, they should just tell him not to do
Yeah.
it. And while we're during an investigation, we're very neutral. We're listening to
Mhm.
all sides. We're getting all of the data. Um, but I'll tell you that statement, if someone doesn't like it, they should just say something, really, really irks me, because
Yeah.
I think everyone should be able to go to work and have the expectation they're not going to be touched unless they
Yeah.
ask for it. As in, when I walk into work, I don't want people come. I'm not a hugger. I don't want people coming up and hugging. Now, if I'm with someone that I trust and I've worked with for a
Mhm.
long time and we both want to hug, you're good to go. That's fine. But the assumption that the person receiving the contact should have to say, "I don't want that," and they're
Yeah.
in the wrong for not doing so is not the right way to go. And I think that's where you need the policy. But certainly, this touchy-feely guy was doing it to women, to men, all races, all ages. Um, and as a supervisor, it got more egregious as it went along. We do find that men are less likely to come forward and less likely to say, "This happened. I was uncomfortable," because there are perceptions of, when you come forward,
Mhm.
you are claiming to be a victim, which is not a term most
Nope.
men want ascribed to them at all, or weak or helpless.
Yeah. We got to
And
turn in our man card.
yeah, and I think about we did, I remember a guy, an older gentleman came and reported to us about something that had happened to him 20 years before. And he said, "I've never told anybody this." And it was his supervisor at the time, a female, who, when he went into the office, she locked the door, and proceeded to come on physically to him. And he said, "At the time, I didn't tell anybody because they would have laughed at me and said, 'Well, that sounds
Mm.
like a great day in the office.' They
Right.
would have laughed it off, and they would have challenged whether or not he wanted to participate." So I think there are still a lot of stereotypes, that we need to overcome. And I think messages like, "Well, why would he ever sexually harass her? She's not even pretty," put a an interpretation that it only happens to certain people. Whereas what we find is it can happen between anyone, to anyone, any race, any gender, any
Mhm.
age. We do find that oftentimes the aggressor or the harasser is somebody who has more power, more rank, more, and it may not even be rank. It may be that they've been in the company for 20 years and
Mhm.
they feel like one of the people who's never going to get fired, and they feel that they're safe in whatever behavior that they have. Um, so yeah, we definitely see it's across the board, but the reporting for men coming forward is still really, really low.
Yeah. And so I'm a hugger. I'm from the South. We hug everybody. But as I, moved up into leadership within
Yeah.
the organizations, I realized that I've got to create that safe space. So, if I've known you for 20 years or we've got a better relationship, you know who to hug. New employees, hey,
Yeah.
welcome. No,
Yeah.
I'm not going to hug you,
Yeah.
right? And from my background of making sure I elicit the truth from somebody, I have one of the techniques is place your hand on the shoulder, right? Because it makes them uncomfortable to lie.
Mhm.
But again, in the workplace as a leader, it's my
Yeah.
responsibility to stop, ask,
Yeah.
and because do you mind, I'm a hugger. Do you mind if nope, I don't want okay, no
Yeah.
problem. And I think I saw another let's kind of go here, another trend over the years as we've opened the doors into our organizations, and rightly so, for the LGBTQ
Mhm.
community. I think there was an uncomfortableness for some people, but now do I have to check jokes? Absolutely, you do. But have you seen anything in that area to where organizations are suffering because that behavior towards that group has caused issues?
Yeah, this is a really timely question too, Larry. So the EEOC recently rescinded their harassment guidance, a whole book that was published a few years ago that gave a lot of examples about what to say, what not to say, things to avoid, and particularly with the LGBTQ community, terms to not use anymore. And it would give those examples. So I'm thinking of when we have an employee who's trans and somebody would make a comment, oh, do I call her him or she he, or comments such as that.
Mm-hmm.
The guidance would say no, just call them whatever they want to be called and go along with it. So now that that's rescinded, I think there is a sense throughout at least some of the workplace that, well, is it okay now that that I can make jokes, I can make comments, I can refuse to call someone by their preferred name. And I would absolutely recommend no. Follow harassment guidance and anti-harassment guidance to ensure that your company is on the right side of protected classes and treating
Mm-hmm.
people equally, staying away from those types of jokes. But I think we did see that there are some folks who, whether it's because of their beliefs or their background, have a really hard time ensuring that they use respectful terms and respectful tone with anyone that they're working with. And that just, yeah.
Let's touch on that for a minute, because
Yeah.
this is one of the things that irritates me, is because, I am a man of faith, right? I have beliefs. You may not believe the way I do.
Yeah.
That's irrelevant, because I've got directions based upon my beliefs that, one of those things is treat people
Mhm.
the way they want to be treated. So, out of respect. If I don't know how you want to be treated,
Yeah.
guess what? It's my responsibility to do. Ask you.
Yeah.
Right?
Ask.
And I was, I was part of the government when the changes came in, and it wasn't hard. It was just
Yeah.
different,
It's
right?
different. Mhm.
I never had someone that worked with me as part of the LGBT community or openly.
Open.
And
Mhm.
so I'm like, I want to have the conversation.
Yeah.
How do I need to respond with this? Had an employee who was married to a service member. They're both he was in the military, and the employee for me had gotten out of the military, but I think they got married while they were in. And you realize there's no difference as a person and as a couple. They go through the same things. They went through a divorce, right? I was able to sit with him because I've been through that.
Yeah.
And there was no barrier, because, I don't, even if I didn't believe what you do, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're a person and you deserve to be treated, with value and grace. Yeah. And
Yeah.
when we saw this change, I'm not going to blame anybody, but when the DEI structure and what you mentioned, we threw out this manual.
Mhm.
I know for me, I'm like, I don't need anybody to tell me how to treat people. I shouldn't. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that do.
Yeah.
So when you took that away, you took the guidelines, because you mentioned it. Oh, so now I can do those. Why would that be the first thought that came through your mind, is that now I can tell jokes?
All the jokes. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to happen, but I think what happens is there's just less emphasis on treating other people with dignity and respect, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the fundamental thing. And when we talk about, particularly when we talk about gay couples, or when we're thinking about in the workplace, that any sort of discrimination because of somebody being gay, somebody being queer, somebody being trans, falls under a protected class
Mm-hmm.
of sex and gender. So there is certainly an aspect to this where if I'm a supervisor and I have two employees, if I'm treating somebody differently because they're gay, that is absolutely a protected class that I cannot discriminate toward them, or there are going to be repercussions. Whether it's a company and that person goes straight to the EEOC, or if they're a federal government worker, there's certainly cases that they can go through an EEO office. But the bottom line is we need to treat everybody equally. And that goes to documentation as a supervisor. So we did have cases where people, I worked EEO issues as well. So if people come forward and say, my supervisor gave me a bad review, was that review based on poor performance, or was it based on a protected class? Was it based on them being a woman, them being a man? And when it comes down to doing an investigation, we're going to look at the documentation.
Mhm.
Is there documentation about performance? And there were times where there wasn't.
Right.
And then when we do the investigation, we hear from other coworkers that, yeah, that supervisor does talk about women behind their back. So even if this employee's issue was because of their performance, if the supervisor's behavior reflects discrimination based on a protected class and there's no other documentation, that supervisor's in the wrong, and administrative actions are going to happen.
Yeah. So we could talk about this for hours, but I usually try to keep these around a half hour to 40 minutes because of people's attention span. So as we close out, can we talk about when should somebody call you in your organization? And I'm going to put, while you're talking about that, I'm going to put up your little QR code there. It's like, if they want to contact you, QR code that takes you to your website. So go ahead.
Thanks,
when
Larry.
Should we call you?
That is great. So we strongly recommend, if there is an accusation of misconduct, whether that's sexual harassment or harassment in general, that an organization look to say, are we the best people to address this allegation? If the allegation is against a senior, anyone in the C-suite, or if the allegation is about widespread misconduct, it's about multiple allegations, we definitely recommend bringing in a neutral body, whether that's Faro Point Consulting or another company. Definitely recommend having someone from outside the organization come in to review the allegations, review the company action so that they're actually taking action, not continuing to sit the people right next to each other where the allegations started. That a neutral investigation is done and then recommendations done. Number one, that's going to help decrease risk of escalation toward lawsuits. It's going to help ensure that all of the company knows that the leadership takes this seriously. And it's going to ensure the recommendations are appropriate for the type of actions that were taken. So that's when we recommend bringing us in. There's certainly options for companies to talk to a lawyer, but quite honestly, what we see are a lot of the allegations about bullying, toxic workplace misconduct can be handled with a consultation, or a firm like ours that doesn't really get into the legal realm. And that's the goal. Let's avoid the legal realm if the issues haven't escalated to that area, and handle it at a lower level as possible by treating your employees right and making decisions that will support the health of the entire organization.
That's awesome. And if you guys think that you have a problem, or give Lisa and her team a call and talk to them. And what we do as Azimuth is we look at the whole organizational health. It's like going to the doctor, right? How many of us go to the doctor just to go to the doctor, right? We do a checkup, but I bet the percentage of people going to get a physical every year is probably low. We wait until we're in pain. We wait until we're sick, then we go. And then we end up treating the wrong thing. So what we do is we look at the organizational structure as a whole. And I mentioned it earlier, across 3 systems: the efficiency, the strategy, the culture, and the leadership. And we determine what your health is and if you need more deeper help. And obviously, if we find something like this, I'm calling Lisa, right? Because that's her expertise. Right. We can identify it and we can put you in with the right people. So if you want to contact my team, here's my information. Please feel free to reach out. And as always, thanks for visiting. Thanks for viewing this. These are done live. If you're watching a recording, there's no editing. It's just out there. So if I said something wrong, I'm sorry, but
we're doing the best we can.
We're doing the best we can. But, organizational health is a serious concern that if you want your organization to grow and succeed, you need to make sure you get it checked. And if you have a problem with sexual harassment, don't let it go unaddressed. So reach out, contact Lisa and her team. And thanks for joining us. And we've got some stuff. Follow me on LinkedIn. We've got some stuff coming up in the next few weeks. We'd love to see you be part of that as well. So God bless and have a great week.